Hello, today we're going to be talking about the literary canon. What is the literary canon? Where did it come from? And most importantly, perhaps, do we actually need a canon? And what are the implications of having to and adhering to a canon? So, let's get into it. Obviously, this video is not like my other ones. I'm not looking at one specific person, I'm just looking at the canon. So, I think it should be interesting. So what the canon is, for people who don't know, the literary canon is just sort of a group of books that the omnipotent people think are good books, are signs of like real literary quality and mastery of that craft, and that everyone should know these books. And it's kind of a wishy-washy term. It's hard to be like, oh, this one is in the canon and this isn't really. But you could say, for example, that Charles Dickens is a canonical Victorian writer. He is a great type and stereotype of the period and the writing that they did and the styles that they used. So he's a canon writer. And therefore, in curriculums, especially at undergrad, you will have canonical writers and canonical periods. So a canonical writer would be Charles Dickens, and a canonical period would be the Victorian period, which is another thing in itself. So we can maybe start with the canonical periods that sort of set out and pave the way for canonical writers. I'm going to say the word canonical a lot and it's going to start sounding like it's not an actual word, but when we think about periods of time, and especially when we're trying to create historical understanding and continuity and make sense of the world, it makes sense to say, oh, under Queen Victoria, this is all the writing that happened to her, and then once she died, this is what happened. But that's silly because she doesn't die and then suddenly there's an entirely new culture, a new way of living. And like Charles Dickens wasn't like killed when Victoria died or whatever, like it's not like these people are to one set time frame. People transcend different times, and that's just not how time works. You can't categorize it. Even when we say like, oh, we're living in the 21st century now, this shouldn't happen in the 21st century. I understand it in the sense of like, this is the modern period to us. But the 21st century really isn't that different from the 20th century. Once you get into the details of it, and like, why would it be? 1999 is not that different from 2000 because it's just days. It's not like you enter a new period and suddenly it's a new way of living. So that's kind of the issue with canonical periods, and then you have canonical writers within that. So, for example, Charles Dickens. Basically, what canonical writers show is like the best writing. This is like a perfect like grade 9 A-star example of novel writing and of writing about class and the Victorian period and the industrial period. And what that does is essentially say to the undergrad reader or to any reader, if you want to learn about this, you need to read this guy because that will tell you all that you need to know and it'll give you a great understanding of the period, which is terrible. So the canon essentially starts from when we begin reading, children's books, Jungle Book, Hans Christian Andersen tales, the Grimm's Brothers fairy tales. These are canonical writers who we say, our children should read these when they're developing. And then once our child starts to understand novels, etc., they should read this and, read Frankenstein and etc. There are set books that even people who don't enjoy literature understand it deeply know. We all know who Mary Shelley is. She wrote Frankenstein. We all know who Charles Dickens is. These are people that are recurring and recurring and recurring, and we kind of beat them to the ground analysing them because, that's correct. And for example, Shakespeare, everyone knows who Shakespeare is. I feel that if you asked everyone in the world to name the greatest author of all time, majority of people would probably say Shakespeare because he is a canonical writer and we know that he has great craft and value. And I say value there because it is good to have a canon in the sense of creating understanding and having some sort of path to go about reading literature. Because if you said like, oh, all novels are created equal, none of them are better than the other, there are millions and tens of millions and billions of books to read. That would just become overwhelming and you wouldn't be able to make a choice. So in the sense of choice, it's a lot easier to say, look at this person to look at this because they're really good at writing this. However, having a canon, where has that canon come from? Who has said that this is a good book that you need to read and this one isn't? It's from authorities that we shouldn't be trusting, essentially. So from governments, from people in power, from upper class, middle class people who suddenly are saying, oh, my taste is better than yours. So if you read Shakespeare, if you read Hamlet and you said, this is terrible, I don't like it, I don't think he's a very good writer, you would be wrong. And because you're not adhering to the canon. He's in the canon, we say he's good, you say he's bad, that's not correct. You should be, when you're writing your GCSE essay, you should be saying Shakespeare is amazing and he's so good at using this and the hamartia and blah 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 and the iambic pentameter. And if you don't, then clearly you just don't understand literature because you're not adhering to the canon. That is a very dangerous narrative because literature is inherently a subjective subject and a subjective idea. Words, we all have a different experience with words. Words work in very interesting, weird ways that we still can't really understand. So then saying that, oh, I have the power to tell you what's a good book and what's a bad book doesn't make any sense in the grand scheme of things. Of course, you can have a bad book. So, for example, 21st century, first thing off the top of my head is like Colleen Hoover and Rupi Kaur. Those are not good writers, but unfortunately, they will sort of be adapted into the canon because of popularity. So popularity is the driving force for the canon. If something is popular, if a lot of people read it, especially in earlier centuries when, if there was a high demand for a book, it's going to get printed more than other books that aren't in high demand. Therefore, that book gets printed more people read it than the other books, and then more and more of that one book. So Charles Dickens, that one was in demand, more are printed, and others are sacrificed. It's about popularity. So then you can't even say that it's a thing of taste because you have books that just aren't tasteful. And again, this is individual. You might think that a book that I hate is a really good book, and that's fine, right? That is fine. But canonically, that would be wrong because all the books in the canon are great and they're so good. And because people like them, that means that it's like a show of like high quality, which is just ridiculous. So, and obviously another massive thing within this canon is ideology. So I've just touched on it being sort of enforced by upper middle class and like governments, etc. But also it's putting forth and placing pressure on white narratives, middle class narratives, and narratives written by men, which is a dangerous thing because it also creates the idea and the fallacy that in the past those are the only narratives that have ever existed. This is not true. There have been female writers, there have been writers that have written about homosexuality, about taboo topics that just aren't in the canon. So then we get this warped idea of how history works because of the books that we read. So for example, the Victorian period, a lot of people would think that the Victorians were repressed sexually, that they didn't have good sex lives basically, and that they didn't they were like, no sex is bad, immoral, etc. First of all, canon books that debunk that would, for example, be Dracula. That is clearly about sexuality. Picture of Dorian Gray, presentations of homoerotic, homosexual friendships and relationships. But also, that isn't good enough to say, oh, these things are in the canon, so we are showing that the Victorian period isn't that way, because it's not a true representative. And what the canon does is say that if you don't have time to read lots of things, if you read all of these, you'll understand everything. But you don't, because if you look further, for example, into the Victorian period, they had porn and porn novels that, to be honest, sound a lot like Sarah J. Maas Thorns and Roses and Colleen Hoover books now, that are very, very explicit and honestly kind of shocking sometimes and kind of make you a bit cringe. It makes you feel a bit, ugh. Sexuality, yay. Some of the books are just cringy. So for example, you have something called My Secret Life, which was published in, I think it was 8 volumes, anonymously, but by someone called Walter. And these books are just horrendous. Every chapter is just like, yeah, I had sex with this one girl, and then I had sex with this other girl, and then I had sex with this, and blah, blah, blah. And it's the same story over and over again, just like when you read a Sarah J. Maas book, each sexual encounter is the same formula over and over and over again. But you would never have expected that from the Victorian period if I hadn't just told you that existed and that was a thing. Which shouldn't be the attitude towards periods. We should understand that they're nuanced and different, and that you can't pick 5 books that tell you everything and characterize the Victorian period, because it's just not true and people have different experiences. And you have working class authors, middle class authors, upper class authors, but we only seem to see this one ideology, which further enforces that ideology, so that when we're reading and trying to develop our own political opinions within our 20s, 30s, 40s, we can't, because we're so used to these canonical authors that we don't really understand human dynamics and how people thought and how people want to think and how people want to express themselves, because we only read it from one very narrow point of view that continues throughout the canon. And then in turn, what that does is create lost literature. So for example, My Secret Life, what I just mentioned, is not really well known. It's lost literature. That should be really interesting, and it is interesting to people, but if people don't know about it and it's not spoken about widely, then it gets lost in time. You know, books are discovered 500, 400 years later that are just incredible to read, but people aren't putting time into finding these or into reading books that aren't canonical because they think it's not worth their time. But what if a book on the shelf that was printed 10 times at the same time as Frankenstein is better than Frankenstein, and then you find it in someone's random shelf in the attic or whatever? You know, we should need to be harbouring and nurturing our literature in a sense that isn't exclusive, which is really hard because there's so much literature, but we shouldn't just be saying, oh, if you're an undergrad English student, you just need to read Dickens, Shakespeare, Mary Shelley, bit of Philip Larkin, and then you sorted James Joyce or whatever. That's not good enough to say that having those ideas, you're set for life and that's fine and you understand literature. And essentially what this ends up prohibiting is individual taste and individual style. It's much like now in social media when we get pushed certain cores, so like cottagecore, blaquette-core, etc. You have to fit a certain mould and you have to adhere to certain tick boxes basically, and if you don't fit them then you don't fit one certain idea. So if you want to be a literary student, and you haven't read these people or you don't like them, then you're not a good literary student. You need to read them deeper and understand them more, which is very harmful to the individual because it takes a subject that is supposed to be liberating and fun and free and kind of weird, and sometimes you don't always understand the metaphors, you don't always understand the words. It takes that fun, zaps it out of it and just says, yeah, this is what you need to look at, blah, blah. It makes it into a STEM subject. Now, although what we can gain from that is learning from what is omitted, so saying, okay, so these books are in it, but let's try and find out what's not in the canon, and maybe why wasn't that in the canon, because oftentimes it will be black authors, working class, lower class authors, people writing about taboo subjects that are omitted from the canon, and that's interesting because that tells us what that era or that period saw as not appropriate, which is really interesting to see. But there's a fine line between understanding a culture's what they accepted and what they didn't, and thinking that that correlates to what was in the society. Just because there wasn't a lot of discourse published widely in the Victorian period about sex doesn't mean that they were void of sex. Okay, people still had sex, people still thought about sex, people still wrote about sex. It's just it wasn't published by the people in power. So it tells you about the people in power, but never about the working class, the lower class, people of colour, people of any minority, which isn't fair, and we shouldn't just accept the canon as it is. I hate it. So essentially, by creating that culture and exclusivity, we hinder the freedom of creative writing that should exist. And I hate the canon, and you can argue with me in the comments, but that's my piece.